So, hey everyone, my name's Hunter, as you know, and today I'll be presenting my change project, which is focused on improving the psychiatric patient flow here in the emergency department and reducing boarding times here at Bristol Regional in our emergency department. So this project really connected with me since I work here in the ER and deal with the issue on a regular basis. It's something that affects not just our patients, but our staff and the overall flow of the department in general. Over the next several slides, I'll walk you through why I chose this topic, how I planned and implemented this change, and what kind of results we saw in the ED from my project, and what I learned here through the process. So here on this slide, you can see I went about identifying the problem we have here in the ED with the psychiatric flow of patients, or with the flow of psychiatric patients. So psychiatric patients often face extended boarding times here. Sometimes we're talking 8 to 12 hours on average. Sometimes longer, sometimes up to 24, even 36 hours. These delays mostly happen because we're waiting on callback responses from external psych facilities for placement, or simply because there's just no psych beds to have these patients placed in the first place. I've personally seen this create major backups in the emergency department. These beds stay tied up for hours on end, with staff having to monitor these patients for hours, or pretty much the entire time that they're there, if they are one-to-one. There's often no clear end in sight for where these patients are going next if they do not have placement and there's just no beds. That makes it stressful for everyone, especially when multiple psych patients are waiting at the same time for placement. So it's not just a flow issue, it becomes a patient safety and staff burnout issue as well, because these staff have to sit for their entire 12-hour shift with this one patient because we, as a system, cannot get these patients moved. So during my next slide here, I'm going to talk about the goals and objectives for my project. So my major goal with this project was to improve how we handle psychiatric patient flow in the ER. Specifically, I wanted to streamline the time patients were boarding and improve the teamwork among the ER nurses when dealing with the psychiatric patients being moved in and out of the emergency department. Another goal of mine was to identify patients early who may not actually need inpatient admission, so that we could avoid unnecessary transfers and maybe refer them to crisis stabilization or outpatient psych follow-up, rather than having them transferred to a psychiatric facility. And overall, the objective was a small one and was aimed at making small changes that could actually reduce the pressure on the department and give better outcomes for these psych patients in general. So, conducting the needs assessment. So my main goal with this was to understand what really needed to be changed. So when I started looking into this, I realized we already had some helpful things in place, like out-of-psych services who would evaluate our patients via telepsych when they were medically stable rather than just being medically cleared. That way we could speed the process up a little earlier. And this was done through Respond. It's our standardized reviewer. This definitely helped and still does help, but we still had huge delays with placement and a lot of back and forth between staff and facilities. I also talked with other ER nurses and looked at some data. The two biggest issues were slow callbacks from the facilities and no available psych beds. So, can't really solve the psych bed problem, but could make smaller changes on improving the callbacks. Another issue was the staff were frustrated with the inconsistent handoffs, not knowing the status of the psych patients during shift changes. This was the main problem with the nurse that was taking care of the psych patients. So there was a need there for this change. We needed better communication, more structure, and a way to make sure the whole team was on the same page during a shift. And this was the main aim of this project, because it was something I felt like I could make a personal change here in the ED. So here on my next slide, we're going to talk about the historical factors of the problems that can be seen over time in the ED. So historically, we've had telepsych available for psych evaluations. And more recently, we've had out-of-house psych services like Respond involved earlier with patients, like I stated before. Right after a patient is medically stable, not just medically cleared, we would have them contact the patient and evaluate them to speed the process up rather than waiting for labs and evaluations from the doctor to have the patient speak to these out-of-house telepsych units. This was a big help because we could get psych eyes on the patient sooner rather than later. But even with that in place, patients were still stuck waiting for sometimes hours afterwards after being evaluated. And a lot of these times they were just sitting in a room on observation, and we'd be calling around for beds or calling back to Respond or the other placement units, trying to find what was going on with these patients, if they were getting a bed, if they were not getting a bed, pretty much just the status overall. The problem was the communication wasn't standardized between us and the telepsych and placement, as well as between the nurses in the emergency department. So different nurses would say different things on the phone depending on the shift. And I've noticed this was a problem with us and with them. I could not make a change with them, but I started where I could and can make small changes here. So, talk about why these changes were needed in the first place. We needed a change because even with the tools already in place, the system was breaking down at these points. These delays were long, the communication was not consistent, and ER staff, especially on nights, are stretched very thin. And if there's a way to free up a tech or a nurse from having to sit with these patients, that is the goal. We have techs and sitters for hours tied up, and nurses trying to track down placement updates in between dealing with other critical patients. Because here in our emergency department, our psych nurse has 2 psychiatric beds and 3 normal beds, just 3 regular ER beds. Whether those 3 regular ER beds are filled with psychiatric patients depends on the day. But if they are not filled with psychiatric patients, the nurse could be taking care of 3 critically ill patients as well as 2 psychiatric patients trying to have them placed. And this caused a lot of stress, not to the nurse and the charge nurse and everyone that was concerned with emptying these rooms up so we could free space up for more patients coming in. And a lot of this stress came from just the not knowing what the plan for these patients were. So it wasn't about adding more work, because of course there's going to be another patient that fills that room right when they leave. It was just about finding something simple that can make this whole process a little bit smoother for the patient and the nurse, and for the next patient, because they're not going to have a room if the other patient has been holding there for the last 72 hours. So, as we've discussed already, and as we're going to discuss again, this change was needed because even with some of the good tools, onto the planning portion. I planned this project by talking with the other ER nurses here in the department and charge nurses, as well as the managers alike, who were seeing the same issues I was. Together, we came up with a standardized call script to use when contacting these psychiatric facilities. The idea was to have one consistent way to give this information so nothing got left out, and was used by each nurse, no matter the shift. And that way, when we called Respond or another psych place, we had something easy and standard to follow. Something that didn't need to be wrote down or anything like that, but it was just a simple set of things to cover every time we called that could be remembered. And something that was easy to deviate from in places that was needed, if there was something different about the patient, so on and so forth. So here's an example of what this script sounds like. Hello, this is blank, the ER nurse's name, an ER nurse here at Bristol Regional. I'm calling about a psychiatric patient that needs placement, or if they already have placement, the nurse could say, I'm calling about a psychiatric patient that is awaiting placement that has been evaluated. The script would follow: the patient is medically stable, evaluated by telepsych, and is currently on a one-to-one observation awaiting placement, and then the nurse can continue with any specifics that was needed, and could ask about updates on placement, or if anything had changed. We also started doing quick huddles during the beginning of each shift, just like we do for right when we clock in, the beginning of the shift huddle, but between the oncoming nurse, the outgoing nurse, and the charge nurse that was taking care of these psychiatric patients. And that way they could have all updated information at the same time, and it wasn't being shared to one person and then shared to another, and something being lost in translation along the way. And that way everyone had the most updated information that was available about these patients. It wasn't anything fancy. It was just making sure, like I said, everyone just had updated statuses on what the next step were for all the psychiatric patients that were placed down in the emergency department. So, here on the next slide, talk about implementing this change. And I feel as though this was not as hard to implement as I thought it may be, as it's hard to get people to change. So we rolled out the call script first, and honestly, it was easy to get people on board. Once a few of the nurses used it and realized it made the call quicker and smoother, more people started to use it, as it allowed for a streamlined way for these nurses to have something to use to call and talk to these psychiatric facilities with. And with the quick and formal huddles during the shift changes, it was especially helpful on the night shifts, when we sometimes don't have as much staff around. So it helped having the charge nurse and the psychiatric nurses actually have a chance to meet when everything wasn't as chaotic or as could be. And we actually started having the sitters that were going to be with the patients come with us as well, and that way they could have more updated information on the patients as well, because they needed to know some of this info as well. So reviewing some of the data through the tracking systems while I was at work confirmed some of what we suspected. Callback delays and the psych bed shortages were the top issues. And the out-of-house psych continued doing their part through the telepsych, which helped us get the patients evaluated faster even if they were still waiting on placement. So, during the evaluation portion of my project, when I look back to see how well this worked with our patients, we did see some improvements. Our average psych boarding times went from 10.5 hours to 9.2 hours, about a 12% drop. Referral completion rates went up from 70 to 78%, and the sitter usage dropped from 35 to 30%. We also had some informal staff surveys that showed 75% of the nurses felt like the communication with psych facilities improved when using this script and when meeting with other nurses, as they felt like they knew more about the patients and knew more about the situation in general. And 65% said they felt like the psychiatric patient flow was better organized. That said, since this was a short-term project and just lasted a few months, I can't say for sure that all these changes were directly from this project. Some of it may have just been natural variation due to the chaotic and unpredictability of the emergency department, but the feedback I felt like was good. And I think the changes we made played a big part in moving things in the right direction, as even small changes are better than nothing. And I think that's something that we should be happy about, as it's hard to make changes in a facility or an organization such as big as Ballard Health at Bristol Regional. So overall, even though this was a small project, really showed me that small changes can add up, like I was saying. Standardizing how we communicate, reviewing our patients in huddles, and having clear info for psych placement showed that none of that took a lot of time to actually implement, but it helped the department flow better. Using this stuff just was simple to use, didn't take a lot of time out of the nurse's day, and made everything run just a small amount smoother for the patient and the nurse. The big issues, like the shortage of inpatient psych beds, are still there and are probably not going to change anytime soon. But that's a bigger system level problem and a problem that's faced everywhere. So what we can control in the ER is how we manage the patients while they are with us here. And this project helped us do that just a small amount more. Going forward, I think continuing to reinforce the process and making sure that new staff are trained on it would help keep the process going and even improve on it some more, as the more people that are involved can change things up and improve things for the better. So in summary, or in references, the references I use throughout the project are displayed above. A lot of this data came from national organizations like the CDC, SAMHSA, and the ACEP, as well as some recent literature on psychiatric board and the ER flow. Well, thanks for listening.